Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the latest Republican presidential debate, Donald Trump's address to auto workers in Michigan, and the controversy around the British comedian Russel Brand. I'm joined by Geoff Shullenberger and Nina Power, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Wednesday night, the Republican presidential field, minus one Donald J. Trump, held a debate. It was watched by quite a few political reporters. I saw political accounts I follow tweeting about it. I'm not sure how many other people watched it or what its significance was. Politico had a write-up pointing out what I think was evident to a lot of people, which is that the absence of Donald Trump loomed large. It seemed like a gathering at the kids' table. Trump, at his speech in Michigan, which we'll get to, said that these candidates were job candidates for positions in a future Trump administration, though he doubted he saw a vice president among them. Geoff, what did you see or hear about the debate?
I'd say it was just kind of surreal that you have this debate where there's, usually in these sort of early primary debates, you have a vast array of candidates, most of whom won't make it. Trump is right in the sense that, usually what that means is that some of them are angling for some sort of position in the next administration. So I suppose what's kind of odd about this is that, and just to give an example from a previous cycle, you had Chris Christie, who is running again. And I think, both in this debate and the previous one was sort of seen as, at least in terms of his performance, coming out of it looking strong. But again, that doesn't really mean anything politically. But in any case, going back to the 2016 primaries, at a certain point, Christie kind of positioned himself as a Trump bulldog, and he kind of went out of his way to trash these other candidates, align himself with the clear front runner.
Yeah, the tri-state wrecking crew taking out all these other candidates from the South and the Midwest.
Yeah, New York and New Jersey guys kind of going up against the mild-mannered Midwesterners. But, basically this time, that dynamic is taken out of it. Trump is often good at pointing out these dynamics that people don't necessarily want to make explicit, but, clearly that is often what happens at these debates. And with him gone and there being no real alternative front runner, it's just kind of a bizarre spectacle because it's not clear what, with these kind of minor candidates who aren't going to win, at least in a normal cycle, you have some reason why they might be there. Whereas this time, it's not clear why anyone is there. I mean, clearly, one thing you notice in the commentary on these debates is clearly one of the audiences is the donor class who are sort of sizing up these candidates. And we remember, again, from the 2016 cycle, there was kind of the Jeb Bush as the initial kind of favorite of the donors completely chokes. And then they kind of have to go in search of the next sort of anti-Trump figure that they can line up behind. So clearly that's part of what's going on with these. They're not really for the public. They're kind of more for the donor class to figure out who they're going to coalesce around if Trump is somehow, taken out of the running, basically. I think that's the main function of all of this, ultimately.
Right. So candidates are auditioning more for donors than for voters in these displays, which in itself seems bizarre because, it makes sense up to a point, but you do have to win votes. You do have to go out and win votes, and it's not going to happen. None of these people is going to beat Trump. But who won the donor primary?
I don't know. It's always hard to tell. It then becomes these kind of bits of pseudo drama around. So there was some drama between Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, who are the two sort of South Carolina, figures who both, and she in fact appointed him to the Senate initially. That they had a kind of tiff. It would seem that overall people seem to like Haley because she is clearly the most old school establishment Republican in just about every way and isn't really pretending to be anything else.
Yeah, she's the recipient of many an award from a conservative foundation. She's been at a gala or two and held some plaques. So she's definitely done the circuit.
I imagine they like the idea of being able to run, a woman of color against Joe Biden as kind of a, haha, we got you kind of spectacle. But, so I imagine that's part of it too. But, she's notable in that she seems to be sort of competent in the debate and seeming to come off better than, say, Ron DeSantis, who was, of course, the donor favorite, before his campaign kind of started to implode a few months ago.
Right. So this is all just painfully kind of boring and seemingly irrelevant. But it's striking. It's so striking because less than a year ago, Trump was left for dead. People maybe thought he wasn't going to be on the debate stage, not because he was so clearly the front runner that he didn't have to go, but because he would just have been shamed out of the race because of his perceived failures in the 2022 cycle, his legal issues. Ron DeSantis was really anointed, as Park McDougall wrote in an article for Unheard by the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando last year. The right wasn't effective. It didn't hold. The magic didn't take. So, Trump, he is still the one. And he spoke at a auto parts supply plant in Michigan. He addressed a mixed crowd of union workers and non-union workers. And he really hammered one message, that the green transition is going to kill union jobs, and that the Democrats don't like the auto industry. They don't like the internal combustion engine. They don't like fossil fuels. They're not the friends of American industry. He asked workers to strike against the globalist class, to join him in an economic nationalist program. He really just pursued exactly the strategy that Michael Lind laid out in his piece for us. Trump can win the union vote in 2024. There, Lind points out that the GOP is the anti-union party, but it can still make and has made powerful and persuasive appeals to union members by appealing to them on the basis of their industry. If you're a member of a union, you're not just a member of a union, you're also someone who participates in a broader industry. And if that industry goes away, if you feel it's threatened, you might have reasons to vote for the party that's less friendly to unions. And as Lind describes in that piece for us, this is how the Republican Party has historically operated in the 19th century. Factory, mine, and railroad workers tended to vote for the grand old party. They backed William McKinley despite the fact that the GOP was more anti-union. And they did so because they feared the agrarian populism of my man, the fellow Nebraskan William Jennings Bryan. They sensed that Bryan didn't have their interests at heart, so they went with the fat cats. So, remarkable moment, remarkable address from Trump, demonstration that he ain't dead yet. He's alive, and I think the union vote really is up for grabs. It's the only way to understand Biden's decision to go to Michigan. Biden can't afford to ignore this. He's fighting for Michigan and fighting for these voters because he thinks they're at risk.
I was just going to say, that what's been pointed out is, he did the speech at a non-union shop, which, makes parts that go into trucks and other vehicles. And, from what I was able to determine, it seemed as if he had been kind of offered this venue by the owner of this factory, or the executive. It's an interesting point insofar as, there are ways in terms of labor relations, and this goes back to what you said about and Lynn's piece, that obviously there are ways that workers and their employers are at odds, right, in terms of basic labor politics. But at the same time, this is particularly true, I think, if you're GM and you can, essentially move factories to Mexico, move them to other parts of the world. If you're a kind of higher up GM executive, then you have a great deal of flexibility, and so you're more fully at odds with your workers. If you're part of the sort of supply chain of the kind of Rust Belt auto parts industry, and you're a smaller factory, I have the quote here actually from the owner of this factory, which is called Drake, who says that basically electric vehicles, this factory produces gear shift levers, and electric vehicles simply don't use those, and therefore a rapid shift to electric would put this factory out of business, right? So, at least with this kind of smaller manufacturing entity, there's an immediate kind of existential alignment, actually, of the workers and the owner, right? Because they're both kind of threatened by various changes that might simply put the whole thing out of business. So that's kind of one interesting dynamic here, that if you look at the kind of ecosystem of different, parts of the manufacturing, of the auto manufacturing industry, it includes kind of these, the big plants from GM and Ford and Stellantis. And then it also includes these kind of smaller factories producing constituent parts. So that was where Trump appeared. And I mean, another point that's worth noting here is, there is kind of a tension within the world of auto workers, as I understand it, which is that, basically the people who work at the big GM shops, they're in a sense, what was called the labor aristocracy, right? If you've got a good union job at a GM plant, you're kind of at the top, and obviously you're at risk in all sorts of ways. But at the same time, you're probably better off than the guy who works at the small gear shift lever factory, right? Which is non-unionized. It's unclear how many of the what the makeup of the crowd for Trump was in terms of how many were union workers, how many were not. There are these kind of tensions within the industry, right? And then, on one hand, you have the fact that the GOP's kind of general policy of making it harder to organize unions has made it harder for workers in these smaller factories, say, to do that. Companies will say to their workers, well, you can unionize, but if you do, then we're going to be outcompeted by, Chinese or Mexican or whatever factories. And so, if you want to keep your jobs, you're better off not unionizing. So I think there's kind of all of these different dynamics. And part of how I read Trump choosing that location is, he was also kind of speaking to this, somewhat more marginal and precarious, not, even more marginal and precarious kind of non-unionized part of the auto industry. And I assume that was deliberate. I mean, it was kind of, if you look at the kind of lefty labor coverage, it was kind of like, oh, how ridiculous. He's claiming to speak for labor, but he's not going to a union shop. But I assume there is a kind of politics in that decision as well.
He did call on the people there to the UAW members to ask their union boss, Sean Fain, to endorse Trump. He said, call Sean, tell him to endorse one Donald J. Trump, and after he does, he can take a nice 2-month vacation. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think what's most notable and probably the best thing that he can get out of it would be for the UAW to remain officially neutral as some kind of wedge against, because basically the UAW, a significant part of the membership, shares this concern about the transition to electric, bringing about, too rapid of a change that would put a lot of people out of work. So, I think probably the best he's going to do is for the UAW to remain neutral, which would be, quite significant if they do.
Yeah, I think they are expected to endorse Biden. I think right now they're inflicting a little pain by delaying the endorsement. I think.
Yeah.
They're going to give in. They're going to give in.
Yeah. They're hoping to extract some kind of guarantee of, as I understand it, Biden is sort of saying, well, we'll provide these subsidies that will allow for a transition, within these factories that will make sure that people's jobs are maintained. So I think they're withholding the endorsement to kind of extract some of these concessions.
Yeah, I have to admit just my own deep hostility to the green transition. The electric cars, charging them up. I mean, in California, we already have brownouts. My dad's an electrician. We had an electric stove in my house growing up, electric heat. So it's kind of, and this was partly because he could, if everything, he would do this and even kind of try to market these things. Like if you have like electric stove, that's better for him than a gas stove. If you have electric heat, that's better than alternate heating. But it just doesn't make sense to have everything be electric, especially when we're trying to not have nuclear power or coal power. Where are we going to get all this power? You can't put up enough windmills or solar panels to run the whole country this way.
Yeah, it's very strange. And the main U.S. automakers have sort of had mediocre sales. Meanwhile, sort of Tesla has shot up to prominence. China is, in fact, really leaning into making electric cars. So I think it's not an entirely ideological project, right? There is this kind of global competitiveness aspect of it. At the same time, I agree that there is kind of a contradiction I've read all these analyses about how you're better off if you care about whatever your personal carbon footprint, just buy a relatively fuel efficient used car, and that's far more beneficial environmentally than buying an electric car.
Well, I want to bring Nina in here because we've moved on from the kind of intricacies of American politics. So, this question of the green transition, which I think living in the UK, Nina, you maybe have some experience with.
Yeah, a couple of things actually, because I'm currently in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the green politics in places that are on the periphery of the EU, places that have not only been battered by war, in the 90s, but are basically been kind of asset stripped and poisoned by EU companies who generally sort of have factories here, and then when they fall apart they just leave all of the crap lying around for people to get sick. So there is a kind of green politics there, which is very different from this kind of discussion around electric cars or whatever. And I think there's a different kind of green washing that's also happening here, which is to do with an idea of eco-tourism, which is sometimes understood as eco-terrorism here, because again, you have this kind of beautiful country that is half destroyed and half untouched. There are still landmines in many of the forests, but nevertheless, there's this kind of move towards exploiting, once again, in a different way, the land of Bosnia and other countries in the periphery for tourism, which completely mitigates against the reality and life of people who are from here, many of whom are sort of surviving in a kind of scavenger economy, very, very high unemployment. And I think we have to always be completely very, very skeptical, very critical of anyone who comes along and promises green solutions. We know that technically a lot of these things don't work and in fact generate more pollution, more kind of waste, more unrecyclable materials. And I can see absolutely from a populist point of view, and just because someone's not in a union, it doesn't mean they can't vote. This is the other thing. So what if Trump isn't talking to unionized workers? They're workers who have a vote. This is, people don't seem to understand that, like, populism also addresses the majority of people, and the majority of people are not in favor of voting to be roasted for Christmas,
Right. Sometimes, some of the people discussing this, talk about labor as if it is just the leadership of these large unions and not people who labor who may be union or non-union.
Right. Which doesn't make any sense. Even at a quantitative level, like you have, you need the majority of votes. That's what it means to win. And, Trump seems to understand this, and other politicians don't. And populism is obviously a huge question in Europe. Not so much in the UK because we have a first past the post system, so it's very difficult for a third party to have to get any hold. But it's it's a huge issue in countries that have suffered like Bosnia, from years of exploitation and war, and are permanently in this kind of transitional phase in which the war kind of never ends, if you like. So just a very outside view at the moment. But just one line I wanted to pick up on from the debate, actually, which was Vivek Ramaswamy talking to Tim Scott at one point said, "Thank you for talking while I'm interrupting," which I think was a very beautiful slip. And it really occurred to me, this we talk about freedom of speech and, this is a permanent political issue, but really, in the debate, it seemed like there was almost like too much speech, an excess of pointless speech, people talking over each other or getting confused. And it really does depend on, Trump is right to create this audience in a way, to say not only to be seen to be speaking to workers, but to actually be speaking to them. And, who says what where, is hugely, hugely important. These kind of artificial debates do sort of pose the question of whether there is a need for certain kinds of speech. And actually this kind of waste of speech, honestly.
Just to go back to the debate for a moment, Gavin Newsom is scheduled to have a debate with Ron DeSantis at the Reagan Presidential Library in November, which, is just, Newsom is ostensibly not running for president. DeSantis is running for president, but it won't win it. So it's just a sort of a bizarre display, but kind of tied to the GOP debate this week. Newsom gave an interview previewing his upcoming clash with DeSantis. And he said that he thinks DeSantis regrets entering the primary race. And so he's really trying to tweak DeSantis, and he thinks that there's a little remorse there on the part of the governor of Florida. Other news, Russel Brand, the British comedian, is the latest kind of Me Too figure. There was an investigation published by The Times in London, reporting allegations from 4 women, charging Brand with sexual assaults in the years between 2006 and 2013. Channel 4 was also involved in the investigation, involved different women, girlfriends, colleagues of his career as a kind of comedian. We don't know exactly what happened in these cases. There's a legal process that'll work out. More will come to light. We don't necessarily know what has happened, but there's been a lot of commentary on it. Geoff, Nina, either of you been following this case? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's been all kinds of hand-wringing and theories, many of which concern the supposed hedonism of the 90s and the 2000s, in which Russel Brand was a sort of popular, extremely always on TV sort of guy. There was this kind of edginess and this transgression that was sort of a big part of popular culture for a long time, which has since shifted, right? The pendulum has swung back towards, but towards safetyism, towards, everyone being a kind of child and needing protection. And so even people who are very much part of the hedonistic transgressive culture are now sort of in their middle age, perhaps regretting some of their decisions, and then somehow I don't know, like sacrificing Brand on the kind of altar of, this is the logic of sacrifice. So he is undoubtedly an excellent scapegoat for this hedonistic period. Although, as I think it was Ben Sixsmith pointed out quite correctly in his Substack, it's not like there isn't enormous numbers of extreme pornography today. For example, people think about the 90s and they talk about lads magazines and how everything was really over the top and really extreme. But actually, in some ways, it was much tamer, but it was a much more in-person series of years, like people went to raves and went clubbing and went drinking, and perhaps it was more excessive in some ways, but it was actually more sociable. And certainly when I was a teenage girl, the idea of sleeping with a successful guy would have been like a huge thing for teenagers. It would have been something very desirable. Now I think the question of age has shifted again. The idea of a 16-year-old girl somehow having sexual autonomy is now sort of frowned upon, especially if she's sort of having sex with a much older man. Except this is not a kind of religious position. It's a kind of moralistic position. And I've tried to speak about this in terms of the idea of the puritanical move, which is a combination of prurient and puritanical. So both kind of, this obsession with lascivious obsession with other people's sex lives in particular, especially those of celebrities, kind of the curtain twitching fascination, combined with this kind of judgmental and often sacrificial logic. So I don't want to say anything about the specific case other than that Brand is a kind of icon of this particular idea of transgression. And, he was very publicly talking about how much he liked having sex. He clearly had sex with lots of women. This is something that famous men often do, or at least they used to. Maybe they still do, but they do it more privately, I'm not sure. And yeah, so it's been the occasion for a great deal of hand-wringing, and it would be remiss of me, and I'm sure Geoff will talk more about this, not to mention very quickly the fact that Russel Brand's own politics have transmuted from a kind of generic transgressiveness to a sort of leftism. He was a big anti-capitalist who was feted by The Guardian and The New Statesman, who brought him on board. My late friend Mark Fisher actually wrote about Russel Brand as a sort of potential leftist populist figure in his controversial essay about the Vampire Castle, Exiting the Vampire Castle. It was a great essay in many ways. But Russel Brand was named it there. You've had a lot of lefties in the last few weeks sort of desperately trying to distance themselves, not only from the sort of lurid allegations, but also from Brand's new shift, which is towards a kind of more dissident figure who is engaging in criticism of the war in Ukraine, also about COVID restrictions and the medicalization. He's sort of invented himself as a sort of guru type health figure. And there is a kind of also obviously conspiracy around the Russel Brand allegations. Why now? Why have these newspapers and Channel 4, who previously hosted Brand, gone after him to such a degree? They very explicitly tried to track down every woman he's ever slept with, tried to get comments on the record. There's no criminal investigation. These are all allegations, often from a very long time ago. There does seem to be, you don't have to be conspiracy minded to see that there is a concerted effort to to take this man down at this point, and many people are asking whether it has something to do with his current political shift, which is towards a kind of dissident populism that many in the liberal media would associate with the right. Although I think those distinctions don't make too much sense anymore, because many of the things that Brand is talking about are, of course, things that the left used to be very critical of, like Big Pharma and so on. But I'm sure Geoff has thoughts on this aspect in particular.
I hadn't followed him that closely in recent years, but I remember I think exactly 10 years ago, he was brought on to edit an issue of the New Statesman, which was kind of and it seemed to be coming out of Occupy. It was kind of this inchoate, emergent left populist politics coming out of Occupy that eventually fed into, the rise of Corbyn in the UK and Sanders in the US. So he was a kind of figure within this sphere. And what was notable about him was he had sort of had this career. I mean, he was in various kind of cheesy and apolitical movies, and he wasn't necessarily considered that political of a figure, but he was this, I think, guy with a sort of relatively humble working class background. And so, he seemed sort of credible as this sort of populist figure. I think that was something that Fisher brought up in the essay that Nina mentioned, where he kind of talks about Russel Brand being, I think, kind of attacked by the sort of prissier and more, kind of identity and sort of etiquette obsessed parts of the left, because he's this kind of brash, working class guy. As I recall, that was sort of part of how Fisher discussed him. But he emerges around 2013 as this kind of outspoken political figure, very much, clearly on the left, kind of calling for revolution, galvanizes this post-Occupy moment before the consolidation of the sort of Corbyn and Sanders insurgencies. And then, the other thing that Nina may remember this better than me, but, I remember him appearing on Newsnight, famous, interview program in the UK, I think around the time he did the New Statesman issue, and sort of he had this showdown with Jeremy Paxman, who's sort of the premier TV interviewer. One of his main messages was people should not vote for the, crappy existing political parties. People should just withdraw from electoral politics and refuse to, give it any assent, which is still very much in this kind of Occupy sort of pre-Corbyn mode of politics. As I recall, the main debate between him and Paxman was kind of him saying, you shouldn't vote. These people are such crooks and liars that you should just, completely reject any engagement with the political system as it is. Paxman was sort of attacking him and saying, how can you, edit a political magazine if you don't vote and refuse to engage with politics? So it was kind of this interesting moment. I think, again, this kind of a last gasp of this anti-politics of the Occupy period that you had on the left before it shifted back into the energy shifted back into this entryist project of, supporting these sort of old left leaders within the electoral system. Yeah. So I think part of what's interesting about him is he's a figure you could see as parallel to certain figures like Julian Assange, who, he's been compared to because of the way that these allegations are, in some accounts, kind of being used to take him down for political reasons. That is clearly true in the Assange case, I would argue. I mean, there's not really any question about it. In the case of Brand, it's maybe a bit more ambiguous, but, he, like someone like Assange, like somebody like Glenn Greenwald, I mean, these are all figures who were kind of more or less attached to this inchoate left sort of anti-politics of 10 years ago, and then have kind of gone through this process where they've sort of been increasingly associated with the right and, understood to be engaged in right-wing politics, in part, but interestingly in part because they're, still critical of the military-industrial complex, critical of Big Pharma. But he does seem like a sort of a figure who's of a piece with a certain subset of commentators and activists who, have kind of undergone this shift, but it's also kind of unclear to what extent they've actually changed versus the fact that we've seen this kind of massive shift in the ideological orientation of the sort of cross-partisan transatlantic establishment, right, towards this kind of more progressive, at least, surface level messaging and the way that even say projects that are, clearly kind of in line with the sort of earlier war on terror era securitization of society, as in COVID, are sort of framed as compassionate and are framed in these kind of terms that are palatable to progressives, whereas, previously they were framed in a somewhat different way, even though the consequences of these projects remain, largely to kind of increase the ambit of sort of state control and surveillance and censorship and things like that. The way these are legitimated and justified has shifted. And so that partly means that somebody like Brand, who is kind of a, somewhat anarchist oriented kind of figure of the left, is now a sort of somewhat anarchist-oriented figure of the right. It's also interesting just the question of how much they've changed versus how much the ideological framing of the establishment has changed. So he's a notable figure in that respect.
I was thoroughly struck, Nina, by your phrase puritanical. It's been observed by various figures that the pornography of the Puritans was anti-Catholicism or anti-Catholic literature, and that often had its expression in these Gothic novels, right? Like The Monk by Matthew Lewis, the classic Gothic novel, English Gothic novel, or the awful disclosures of Maria Monk in the U.S. Part of those novels is that kind of political, religious, cultural other kind of identified with foreign lands is seen as having kind of gross sexual appetites, and a certain relish for coercion. And I wonder if those Gothic categories are still kind of operative in our imagination in some way. I mean, we've already alluded to vampires' castles here, so maybe we still think in those Gothic terms.
It's an interesting question. I mean, this swing towards this kind of puritanical thing is, definitely something that's happened in my lifetime. Brand is definitely, whatever the truth of the matter is, a scapegoat in this shift. But it seems to be liberalism talking to itself. It's like, on the one hand, you have this kind of end of history, sexual revolution, second generation, second summer of love, like the 90s, 2000s, kind of completely post-religious, sort of pre-internet, though, way of being, which is completely secular, we might have to say. And then you have the backlash, but it's not a religious backlash exactly. It's something else. And perhaps this, I don't know, happens anywhere. I mean, we could have a Girardian anthropological reading, but there's something about the sexual revolution or the aftermath in which its kind of greatest warriors are being rounded up and Robespierre'd somehow, and I say this not to undermine the reality of abuse. We obviously saw that in true Technicolor horror with figures like Jimmy Savile in the UK. But I don't think Brand is quite like that. People are trying to tie Brand to a kind of Savile-esque position, but I don't think this is quite accurate. But I think there's something about this kind of moral disgust or this kind of revulsion towards the sort of sexually incontinent that was that who was at the time sort of celebrated as this great figure of ribald, excess and enjoyment and pleasure. I mean, is it simply that everybody gets older and less energetic, or is it, as you say, it suggests, Matthew, perhaps a repeat of various religious logics once more? I don't know. I'd have to think.
Gothic revival, maybe we're undergoing it. All right, with that, thanks, Nina. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks to you, listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. There you can read Michael Lynn's article, Trump Can Win the Union Vote in 2024, and everything else we publish.